The sun rose softly over the still lake, its golden light scattering across the water like shattered glass. My neighbors stood in silent disbelief, clutching their morning coffees as they stared at the sight before them. A solid 6-foot wooden fence now sliced straight through the middle of what had once been a shared lakefront paradise. Splitting lawns, cutting off water access, and even severing the community dock in half like a bad magic trick. On one side of the fence, Brenda's cousin Chloe stood frozen with her mouth open, staring at her trap setup, luxury lounge chairs, a gleaming jet ski ramp, all now caged in by wooden panels. On my side, I calmly tightened the last bolt, wiped the sweat from my brow, and gave the stunned crowd a polite little wave. But to really understand how we got here, I have to rewind a few years. 5 years ago, I bought my dream home in Cedar Ridge Estates, drawn in by one irresistible promise: deeded lakefront access. That property came with legal rights to the shared waterfront, a wide sandy beach, and a community dock that my kids adored. Every summer weekend was pure magic. Hours spent swimming, fishing, grilling, and watching sunsets melt into the water. It was everything I had worked for, and every cent of the lakefront premium felt worth it. Everything changed 6 months ago when Brenda Kensington became our new HOA president. If you've ever wondered what happens when someone with a Napoleon complex gets even the tiniest whiff of authority, well, Brenda was the case study. Within weeks, she'd slapped homeowners with new fines for grass growing half an inch too tall. She declared wind chimes a noise hazard and banned them entirely. She even required written permission to plant any flowers not on her personally approved list. But Brenda's true talent: nepotism. Her brother-in-law suddenly had a paid position as our landscape inspector. Our best friend snagged the contract for pool maintenance. And when her cousin Chloe flew in from out of state, Brenda seemed to decide the HOA bylaws were more like polite suggestions. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet Tuesday morning. I stepped outside to find Chloe staking her claim on the shared lakefront. And I don't mean with a towel and chair. She was setting up what looked like a private resort. Top-tier lounge chairs, a full speaker system, tiki torches, and workers installing a private jet ski ramp. It completely blocked my family's access to the water and ruined the view we'd cherished for years. I walked over, polite and calm, and introduced myself. Chloe looked me up and down like I'd interrupted royalty. In a clipped, dismissive tone, she informed me that Brenda had reassigned that portion of the lakefront for her exclusive use during her extended visit. Apparently, she thought my family was wasting the space by only using it on weekends. She, on the other hand, needed it for her book club gatherings. When I pointed out that the waterfront was shared deeded property, she waved a piece of paper in my face and smugly told me to take it up with the HOA if I had a problem. It was something called an easement reassignment, dated just 3 days earlier. According to that paper, the HOA board had voted to grant Chloe temporary exclusive use of half the shared lakefront, claiming it would maximize community resources. And to make it even more insulting, the vote was supposedly unanimous. Despite 2 board members being out of town that week, that was my first clue that something smelled fishier than the lake after a summer storm. I immediately contacted the city planning office and the county property records department. Both confirmed what I already suspected. The lakefront rights were deeded to individual properties, not controlled by the HOA. Changing that would require legal documentation and signed consent from every affected homeowner. Brenda's little reassignment was legally worth about as much as a doodle on a napkin. When I brought all this up at the next HOA meeting, Brenda's face turned a shade of purple I didn't know humans could achieve. She gripped the podium with white knuckles and practically screeched that the HOA had recently amended its bylaws to include waterfront management. Anyone interfering with board decisions would be slapped with $500 daily fines. Then, as if on cue, she whipped out another piece of suspicious paperwork, claiming this bylaw change had been approved during a special meeting the previous month. Funny how no one else on the board remembered attending that meeting. Meanwhile, Chloe had turned our tranquil lakefront into a non-stop party hub. Her speakers blasted music from dawn till night. Her guests trashed the sand with beer cans and fast food wrappers. The jet ski ramp was a giant eyesore and broke at least 3 environmental regulations. The final straw came one morning when my 8-year-old daughter went down for her usual swim. Chloe physically blocked her path and told her it was now private property. My little girl came home with tears streaming down her face. That was it for me. I spent the next week doing what I do best as a contracts lawyer, digging through every line of documentation. I pulled my original purchase agreement, the property survey, the HOA charter, and 2 decades of meeting minutes. The truth was beautifully simple. Not only was the lakefront access permanently and irrevocably deeded to specific lots, including mine, but the HOA charter clearly stated the board had 0 authority over deed property rights. Any attempt to tamper with those rights would make the board members personally liable for damages. I drafted a formal legal notice to both the HOA and Chloe. They had 72 hours to remove all personal items and restore community access, or I'd take them to court to protect my property rights. I sent it certified mail and email, then waited. Their reaction was as predictable as a summer thunderstorm. The next morning, Brenda showed up at my front door with Chloe at her side, and some man in a wrinkled suit who claimed to be a lawyer, but looked like his legal education came from daytime TV court shows. They came at me from every angle: threats, bribes, and desperate attempts to sway me. Brenda tried the reasonable approach first, flashing a strained smile and promising to waive my HOA dues for an entire year if I would just drop the issue. Chloe chimed in with her own ridiculous offer. My family could use the lakefront every other Wednesday, as if access to deeded property were some kind of timeshare. And then there was the lawyer, mumbling about adverse possession and squatters' rights like he'd memorized a few buzzwords from a legal drama. I actually laughed out loud while I calmly declined all their offers and showed them my own legal credentials, their faces twisted from fake charm to fury. Brenda hissed that I'd regret ever crossing her before they all stomped off in a storm of indignation. The 72-hour deadline came and went without a single piece of furniture being removed. In fact, Chloe had doubled down, dragging out more patio sets and even starting construction on what looked like a permanent shade structure. Fine, if they wanted to play hardball, I had phase 2 ready. I hired a licensed surveyor to mark the exact property lines of the lakefront. When the results came in, they were crystal clear. The waterfront access was deeded down the middle. Each homeowner had rights to their section, and Chloe's elaborate setup sprawled well beyond hers, trampling over mine. Armed with the official survey, I drove to the local building supply store. The teenage clerk's eyes went wide when I told him how much fencing I planned to buy and where it was going. In a small community like ours, word travels faster than the wind on the lake. By the time I got home, my phone was buzzing nonstop with curious neighbors asking the same question. Are you really putting up a fence down the lakefront? I gave them the simplest answer. I'm just marking my property line. The next morning, just after dawn, I showed up at the lakefront with a professional fence crew. We had everything: permits, survey stakes, and enough fence panels to make Robert Frost smile. The line was perfect, straight as an arrow, slicing across the sand, down the dock, and all the way to the water line. Clean, legal, final. At 7 a.m., Chloe stumbled out of her house with a mug of coffee, just in time to see the panels going up. The mug slipped from her hands and shattered against the deck as she let out a scream loud enough to rattle the ducks on the far shore. Within minutes, Brenda arrived, still in her bathrobe and curlers, and behind her came half the neighborhood, clearly ready for the morning entertainment. The meltdown was nothing short of spectacular. Brenda hurled every accusation she could think of: vandalism, trespassing, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and even identity theft for some reason. She called the police. They showed up, checked my permits and survey, then shrugged and left. She called the city inspector. He confirmed the fence was perfectly within code. She called the mayor, her congressman, and, I swear, I think she tried the president. Each call ended the same way, with her voice getting higher and more desperate. Chloe wasn't doing any better. Her precious jet ski ramp now sat half inaccessible behind the fence. Her speaker system was cleanly bisected, one speaker mocking her from my side of the line. The half-built shade structure straddled both sections, rendering it completely useless. Her construction crew quietly packed up their tools and drove off as she stood there, opening and closing her mouth like a stranded goldfish. That evening, the emergency HOA meeting drew a packed house. Brenda had gone on the offensive, printing flyers calling me a neighborhood terrorist, destroying property values and community harmony. She stood at the podium, voice trembling with rage, demanding that the board find me into bankruptcy and order the fence torn down. But that's when the tide shifted. Tom Bennett, a retired judge who lived 3 doors down, stood up first, calmly, clearly. He explained to the entire room that the board's recent actions had exposed them to personal liability. Sarah Collins, whose flower garden had been bulldozed under one of Brenda's beautification projects, presented her own legal findings. Then more neighbors followed, one after another. By the time 6 homeowners had spoken, it was clear the Brenda era was crumbling. The calls for her resignation started as murmurs but quickly grew into a chant. The final blow came when Chloe's husband flew in from out of state. He surveyed the mess, the fence, the trashed setup. Chloe sobbing in her oversized sun hat and made an executive decision. They were leaving. As movers carried their furniture away, neighbors overheard him telling Chloe that her cousin's power trip had dragged them into an expensive disaster. Brenda made one last desperate play. She stood at the podium and dramatically announced that as HOA president, she was issuing an executive order to have the fence removed. That's when the board's attorney, who had been silently scribbling notes all evening, finally stood. His words cut like clean steel. Brenda had no such authority. Her actions had already exposed the HOA to multiple legal vulnerabilities, and the board needed to act immediately to contain the fallout. The vote that followed was swift, unanimous. Brenda was removed as HOA president on the spot. But that wasn't the end of her nightmare. The board also voted to pursue legal action against her for misuse of HOA funds. It turned out she'd used the association's legal budget to pay for Chloe's bogus easement paperwork. And further accounting revealed she'd been skimming from the landscaping budget to pad her brother-in-law's fake inspection contracts. 3 months later, Brenda stood trembling in front of a judge. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the verdict was read, guilty of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Her sentence, 2 years probation, 300 hours of community service, and restitution of $47,000 to the HOA. The judge's closing remarks were scathing. He emphasized that abusing community trust for personal gain was a serious offense, one that came with real consequences. As the gavel came down, Brenda broke down completely, sobbing into her attorney's arms. Her self-proclaimed reign as the neighborhood tyrant was over, not with a bang, but with the sound of her own downfall echoing through the courtroom.